kind of will go through them usually, or if I weren't here, Laura would probably, until you elect your chair. So with that being said, I'm just going to call roll. So Jack Lee Harris.
Here.
And James Wright.
Here.
Rufus Slade.
Here.
Greg Boyer.
Here.
Brian Chandler.
Here.
And our other member would have been Robert Wasco, but I will indicate that he is absent. Then the first item for your consideration is approval of the minutes from November 18th of 2014. And I have attached those in the hard copy for you as well.
I'd make a motion to approve the minutes.
I'll second.
Motion by Mr. Boyer, seconded by Mr. Wright. Those in favor?
Aye.
Any nays? Motion passes 5-0. Next is the designation of a chairperson. Do we have any nominations for a chair?
I make a motion for Brian Chandler.
Thanks, Greg.
Any other nominations? And take out the second. We typically don't give you a second for a motion. All those in favor of Mr. Chandler being our chair for this meeting?
Aye.
Any nays? Mr. Chandler, you are now our chair. I'll go ahead, if you're okay, and do the next one. The law requires that we have a seventh member, and that the seventh member has experience operating a crematory facility, but is not affiliated to a cemetery or a funeral home. In the past, you will see on the front of your handouts, we have gone with R. Grant Williams, an individual that we knew from Boardman, Ohio, who had operated a cemetery for a long period of time, but was not associated to a funeral home or a cemetery. However, Mr. Grant usually doesn't come to a meeting because he doesn't become a member until you vote him in.
He did what?
He doesn't come to the meeting because he doesn't become a member until you vote him in. But if you do proceed with him again, or anybody else that you would choose, and we have a situation from this point going forward where we would convene the board, we would then call that individual in. So are there anybody that you would want to nominate as that seventh member? Should we have a need to have a hearing?
So can we nominate as Grant Williams?
Yes. So is that okay if I put that Mr. Wright nominated again? Mr. Williams?
Yes.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes 5-0. And so at this time, typically, I'll just turn it over to your elected chair, and if you have any discussion, I'll keep note of what the discussion, somewhat of a tape would entail, or if you make any decisions, then I can record any motions or votes that you might make until you're ready to adjourn.
We'll move on to agenda item number 3, new items for discussion. Any new items anybody wants to discuss?
I know last time we talked about Floral Hills Cemetery, about being unregistered and should not be operating without a registration. Well, I did have a conversation with the prosecutor's office at Ross County, spoke with his secretary. So they decided to put it on the ballot. So there's a newspaper where they decided to put it on the ballot. And in the other paper after the election, it passed. So now township trustees have an operating levy for Floral Hills Memory Gardens. I'm not sure what's going to take place next, if they're going to eminent domain the cemetery and possibly take it over. But I think first they wanted to see if the voters had an interest in possibly for the township to take over the cemetery. And it did pass, I think, by about 50 votes. So if anybody wants to see the paper or wants a copy of it, then,
Very good.
so,
That's taken on quite a bit.
trying to see what it was a 54% blend to 46%, about 100 votes. So it must have been like 54 to 46.
What happened to the former owners?
One went to Texas and one went to Florida, and
It's a mess.
but this is the next start. So now I don't know if they're going to, township trustees are going to go to the prosecutor's office and take it over.
I've dealt with the one, okay, I have dealt with the one in Circleville before.
Well, the one in Circleville is different. This is the one in Masseyville. The one in
Oh.
Circleville still has a license, I
Okay.
believe, don't they? I think Floral Hills, Circleville, and then the one in Masseyville were operating without a license, but basically they couldn't sell any more graves, they couldn't sell any more caskets, vaults, or monuments, but they still continued to allow people to be buried there. But we'd gone through Kim Danner, and she was at the office in Circleville. So she was unaware that even happened.
So you say the township trustees have?
Huntington Township. So they passed an operating levy for the cemetery.
And have they taken?
They haven't done it.
operations
This
of that?
just happened recently. I'm not sure what the next step is. I know it's not illegal for somebody to work on a cemetery township unless it is their property. So hopefully that'll be the next step that they take over.
The prosecutor, as the township's representative, will probably be highly involved in that.
Okay. So that's a good news.
Thank you, Greg.
If you don't mind me taking it,
Okay.
I'll upload it to the
Okay,
minutes.
okay.
So then the article's right here.
Any other new items for discussion?
I wouldn't mind knowing if there's any advancement in the proposed legislation to do away with this board. I've not heard anything recently.
The last piece of information that I had from Representative Schaefer's office, still included in their proposed legislation to abolish the Crematory Review Board. All versions that I've seen have that included, but I do not have an introduction date. Last piece of information I had was that they had gotten some more information from interested parties and had not determined an introduction date, so I don't know. All versions that I have seen though does add a crematory operator to the funeral board.
Right. So, without this board, is that adding more duties onto the board, the funeral board?
If we talked about the legislation in the version that we saw as we met when we were interested parties, no, it wouldn't add any more work. It would actually reduce and kind of streamline the work. So it would just eliminate one step in the process if we had an issue specifically with a crematory. So it would not add any additional work because in the process we have right now, it requires that to go to this board, and then this board make a recommendation to the funeral board. So the funeral board still would have had to have heard a case involving the cemetery. So it wouldn't add anything
You
new.
mean crematory?
A crematory, yes, a crematory.
But wouldn't this board do the investigating and then pass their findings on?
The funeral board's investigators would be the people out in the field who would actually have conducted the investigation. And then
The
we
physical,
presented,
the
we
physical
would, right,
investigation.
we would present back all of our case findings to this board, for this board to hold a hearing,
Okay.
and then to make a recommendation to the funeral board.
So the crematory review board, in essence, currently would work as in lieu of a hearing officer through the 119 process.
No, only because, keep in mind that a licensee would still have rights to a 119 hearing after the board issued a violation. So it's just removing a step. The way it's currently drafted, what we have to do now, not the drafting, sorry, is if you had a problem with a crematory, we would investigate, when I say we, the funeral board, we would convene this board, we would present all of our findings to this board. This board would then write a recommendation to the funeral board. The funeral board then could take that recommendation but could issue whatever they deemed fit. The licensee then has the right to a 119 hearing. So it's just removing a step in the process for the funeral board.
The
And licensee.
the crematory member that you're proposing that would be added to the funeral board, would that be an independent crematory owner, or would it be a funeral director with a crematory?
The legislation that I saw spoke specifically to it being a crematory operator associated to a registered cemetery. I do know that there were interested parties that were opposed to that, but I think you were aware of that in that meeting that we had as well. So I do not know right now if there is a new version or the last version I saw still included that. But I know that they've had additional meetings with interested parties, and I don't have more information. And I think what you probably already previously seen. But I do know, like I said, there are interested parties that would like to have that just be any crematory operator, which is what they had said in our interested parties meeting. So that it opened it up to everybody that potentially had that permit, if it were put in legislation, if we issue it.
Okay.
I did reach out to Justin and Representative Schaefer's office, to see if there was any other input to provide for.
That's the AE.
That's the one we met with. For this meeting, or for, I was supposed to have a meeting yesterday that we weren't able to secure a quorum for, and that's when I was told that about the interested parties and that they don't have an introduction date right now, so that's all I'm going to do.
Okay.
Any other discussion, any new items?
On the crematory inspections, do we have a number for this year? As far as what they're doing?
All of the crematories have been inspected this year, so there are 135.
135?
Mm-hmm.
What's when you say this year, is that a state fiscal year or calendar year?
It is a rolling calendar year, so we look particularly, let's say this month, and we run a report as to who is supposed to be inspected, and their 1 year is up now, and so it's a rolling calendar year. It's not associated to a fiscal year or January through December chronological year.
What about the gentleman in Toledo?
What would you like to know, Ryan? Just what happened in the case, or?
Yes.
Okay. It's the Tate Funeral Home, and Robert Tate was the individual who was the only licensed funeral director at the facility. And in late May, as you may have seen from the paper, we had a case where we had a consumer who contacted us concerned that their family member had not been cremated yet. They had been contacting Mr. Tate to get the cremated remains of their family member, and he had given them a different series of answers over a period of weeks as to where their family member was or the status of their family member. They had contacted the local crematory to try to find out if they knew or had any information, or could maybe they come and get their loved one from the crematory, and found out, at least from that crematory, that they had never seen their loved one. So with that, we believed that the body was still at Tate Funeral Home and that quite a bit of time had elapsed. So we, within 24 hours of receiving the phone call, sent an inspector to the facility, and the inspector went in to determine what was going on and to conduct an inspection, and found 11 bodies in various stages of decomposition in the funeral home, or on the premises, I should say, contacted me. I then called the Toledo Police Department and left from Columbus and headed straight to Toledo. The police department secured the scene, but decided to wait to enter the premises until I got there. Lucky me. And so at that point, it was myself, the Toledo Police Department, and the coroner's office, who they kind of decided how we were going to go in and who was going to lead the way and what was going to happen. And I followed through with them, and we then found 2 bodies in cremation containers and an auxiliary chapel. There were several chapels in the facility. We also found one individual who had recently deceased and was not necessarily an issue with the condition of the body in the embalming room. We also found an infant in a container in the embalming room. And then we found numerous other individuals, the remaining of the 11 count, in what I would describe as an attached garage. It had a garage door, and it, then led in. It had 2 doors. One led into the embalming room, and one led into kind of a office sort of area of the facility. In that room, or that garage area, there was no lighting. There was no air conditioning. There was a very dilapidated roof with, if you think about May, it had rained a lot in May, so there was a lot of water still dripping down from the roof and across the floor. There were buckets on the floor trying to contain some of the water, but there were numerous people on cots, one on a shelf, and then there was one instance where there was a gentleman and a cremation container and another lady stacked on top, just on top of the cremation container. And they were in gross neglect, is the best way to put it. And since then, we convened an emergency meeting of the funeral board. We immediately summarily suspended the funeral home and Mr. Tate's license. Mr. Tate did ask for a hearing, so he did ask for a 119 hearing, but stated that ability to have the hearing until after his criminal case had proceeded. And as of, I think, about a week and a half ago, Mr. Tate pled guilty to a felony charge of abuse of corpse, and then several other charges of misdemeanor charges of abuse of corpse. And my understanding is that in that plea agreement with the prosecutor's office, he has agreed to be permanently barred from the funeral industry. And so our Attorney General is drafting that agreement for his permanent barment and is getting that signed and his signature obtained from him. So that is the intent, would be that he would be permanently barred, and meaning that he would not be able to work in the funeral industry, hold a license, or hold any position that even didn't require a license.
Is that in Ohio or national?
That would be in Ohio. Although if there were any concern from another state, that any settlement agreement that we would have and would be a public record, and we would be free to send that to any state if he so choose to go to another state and make a concern about working in the funeral industry. We could send it there.
Was there any involvement with the crematory that he used? I know these bodies were scheduled for cremation, so that he used a third-party crematory, correct?
He actually, my understanding is Mr. Tate used 2 different third-party crematories.
And there was no involvement of the crematories. It was all the funeral director. I mean, it was.
There was no negligent part on any of the crematories that he had ever worked with, no. No, they
No refusals of cremation or
No.
anything.
No, they weren't aware that these bodies were there at all. And in fact, my understanding is that both crematories, after this case happened, were both more than willing to try to work with any funeral home that then got these bodies to get them properly cremated. But there was no concern with any of the crematories. No involvement, and no knowledge on their part. I do believe if you looked at our case information, you would see that Mr. Tate did owe quite a considerable amount of money to both of them.
So he's being prosecuted.
Yes, he's pled guilty. I don't believe sentencing happens until, I would want to give you a wrong date, but it's, I think, like the beginning of part of December. That's when he's scheduled for sentencing.
Okay.
Any other questions about it?
Any items for discussion? If not, do you want to make a motion to move for adjournment? A motion?
I'll make the motion to adjourn.
Take a second. All those in favor, say aye.
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 All those opposed, same sign. Motion carried.